Uncle. You have to come. To hell and back. That's responsibility right there, man. There it is. Dangling that carrot. Got him. That really got his attention. The fact that she said it, that means, you know, of course she heard it from Okabe himself, right? She called him uncle, right? So you're seeing some striking differences here, right? The contrast from alpha and beta. So she knows her dad in the future. Door number 3, right? John Teeter. Yeah, there's contrast on display. Not a shocker, you know, I've always expected this, but insane. Full circle. Oji-san. I love that. There's a relationship, clearly, in the future. Oh, close call. He's about to run into Kurisu any moment now. You tried to tell me something 15 minutes ago. Had a distressed look on your face. Episode 1. Yeah. Yeah. Time machine. Ah. Jumpy, right? Oh. There's that distressed look. Did you feel something there? Something familiar. Yeah, she's got these papers on time travel. I missed the second bit. Ah, it's him. Yeah, it's him. Yeah. Nakabachi, you son of a bitch. It simply had to be him, right? Dialogue's a bit clunky there. Oh my god, did he kill his daughter? This fucking guy. There's that physical abuse. Fuck. Okay. This is a bit bizarre. Come on. Careful, man. I saw that screwdriver. Oh. Okay, this is just a bit unrealistic now. He's a bit too cartoony. It's not the screwdriver, is it? It's that. Why the fuck does he have a knife on him? Still. Oh, fuck. Predestination paradox. It's a bitch. That's still your daughter, though. I mean, I can't buy it. You know, he's a little too cartoony. I suppose your dad is your dad. I was afraid of this even back in episode 1, man. Predestination paradox. The scream. No, that's not the scream. Time out, time out. That's not the scream. I distinctly remember him sounding like he's in agony, like in pain. That's not the scream. Put a pin in that. My God. How is this guy ever going to recover from this psychological damage? She's really composed. Fair enough, man. SG. How the hell did he get that? The key to time travel, Makise Karisu. Time travel arms race. Like CERN in the beta timeline. Oh. The psychological residue of the alpha timeline. It's a broken man. Psychologically broken man. Fair enough, man. Fair enough. Oh. He's not, but... Static? Guessing it's not about to be static anymore. Had to be maintained. He knows it. Punished Okabe from the future. Some pain is necessary. Look at this. Has to be maintained. And that started it all, right? Chills. Ah.
俺たちがクリスを助けたいと願ったからこそ到達できた場所なんだ。だから騙せ。お前自身を。クリスが死んだという過去を変えずに彼女を救え。
So stage it.
生きているクリスを過去の自分に死んだと観測させろ。そうすれば過去改変は起きない。
Okay.
そうか。ちなみにタイムマシンの形式
Ah, new name.
C204 型
Or different timeline, right? Beta.
頭文字が何を意味するか言うまでもないな。クリス
Oh.
そして目的の世界線をスタインズゲートと名付けた。
You don't say.
なぜその名なのかもお前ならわかるはずだ。特に意味はない。そうだろ。これより最終ミッションオペレーションスクルドの概要を説明する。確定したことを変えずに結果を変えろ。血まみれで倒れているマキセ・クリスト、それを見た岡部倫太郎、その確定した過去を変えずに結果を変えるのだ。最初のお前を騙せ。世界を騙せ。
Wow.
それがシュタインズゲートに到達するための条件だ。健闘を祈る。エル、プサイ、コングレ。
Unreal. Show me more of that, Okabe, man. Punished Okabe. Love this. Full circle. Come on. Hell yeah. My face hurts from smiling. Brilliant. Come on. Wow. Unreal, man. Unreal. Exhilarating. And you know the crazy thing is, earlier on I mentioned the scream, right? That it didn't quite match up. I mean, it's really quite noticeable that it doesn't match up, right? Because like I said, the scream that, you know, both I and Ocarine and Mayuri hear is one of someone in pain and agony, someone being Ocarine, the other Ocarine that I've assumed since day one. That was not the scream. So, you know, the crazy thing is, I think I've already not seen but heard this final attempt, the final mission at play during episode 1. Because that's a different scream, man. Our Okabe is in pain. I mean, this, you know, our Okabe is in pain in this one as well, but that's a different type of scream, man. It just is. Okay, let's get into it, folks. The penultimate episode of Steins Gate. And it's a special one. It's a special one. It's just so thoroughly satisfying, man. And, you know, listen, I'm certain that this might be, or might have been, perhaps the most animated I've been during an episode in recent memory, or in a long time at least. And, you know, ultimately, that's simply because it's just that type of episode. You know, long-standing speculation and hypotheticals and concerns being confirmed or addressed altogether, right? I mean, this episode has devastating lows and dizzying highs. It puts both Okabe and us, the audience, into the dirt, right? In the most devastating fashion, in the most devastating manner possible, to then pull us out from that pit of misery and darkness in the most enthralling manner possible. You know, that whole Kiyoma and mad scientist persona has such a new dynamic. It takes such a new dynamic by the end of this episode, right? The resonance of it. You know, that end of episode declaration as he strikes the Stardust shake hand, right? That right there is legitimately one of the most exciting return to form moments I've seen in recent memory. And it just ends on such an incredible and hopeful note. Right now, does that mean it's about to be smooth sailing from this point on? Exceedingly unlikely, right? You know, I'm certain that this finale, you know, the execution of this final mission is about to have its own, mini drama built in, its own high stakes and unknowns. And again, one of the biggest head scratchers being Okabe's scream, right? Him screaming in pain and agony. And, I spoke of it right after that, after the ending of that episode. And of course, I'll go into it a bit more because, it's not as clear cut. It isn't. If you really start to think about it, there are some things that are not quite adding up, as far as the different screams. Now, one thing is for certain, there are two different screams. That's a given. I'm not just hearing things here. That's a fact, and I think it's by design. It has to be by design. It's not just some oversight, that there's two distinct different screams. So let's put a pin in that for now and come back to that. But, all of this little mini odyssey that's presented, just within this episode 23, one of the driving forces, the major driving force behind it, as it simply has to be, is the tremendous voice acting performance. Once again, my goodness, I thought I've seen it all, but right here, the acting on display throughout this episode is phenomenal, exceptional. Like I said a little bit earlier, it just takes us through a range of emotions, right? The lowest of lows and the highest of highs, the dizzying highs, the enthralling highs, all facilitated by this incredible acting performance. It's incredibly authentic. It's believable. I felt the pain just coursing through it, right? I felt the joy coursing through it, the hope, right? Coursing through it. It is tremendous stuff. It is exceptional stuff. And it just further cements this as one of the greatest performances in anime, right? It just does. And yeah, man, even though it has this incredible build-up to this rousing and enthralling ending and declaration and breakthrough, the episode is actually full of some incredibly dark and, sad moments as well. Heartbreaking moments at that. At the core of it, there's something incredibly heartbreaking. For me, at least, at this point. It just is, isn't it? The whole reason this is even possible, right? The whole reason our Okabe is in a position to attempt this final mission, to possibly open door number 3, the promised land, Steins Gate, right? Not alpha, not beta, Steins Gate, though, of course. And ultimately, it means nothing. Another incredible moment as future Okabe and our Okabe are in complete unison, on the same page. And that right there, it's a gripping moment. It's one of the best moments of the entire anime for me. Just that little moment of them, saying it at the same time, right? In unison, and just understanding that they are on the same page. Our Okabe understanding, yes, this is it. This makes complete sense. All of it. I am going to put all my trust in my future self. I just love the idea of that, across time, completely in sync, right? And ultimately, future Okabe from 15 years from now essentially knows everything that his past self needs to hear, right? To, set him up for success as much as he can. And ultimately, that's, that kind of brings me back to my initial point about the heartbreaking nature at the center of it all. Future Okabe. The fascinating thing about all of this is that future Okabe might have actually gone through, right? Might have actually experienced something I initially feared, at the midpoint of this episode. This idea of being psychologically scarred, right? For life, perhaps. Right? And how the hell is Okabe ever going to recover from this? That was my major concern after, that huge twist, right? For him at least, the cruel and devastating notion of predestination paradox, that he himself is responsible for Kurisu's death. Accidental, but ultimately him being there, him trying to stop it, is the reason it ultimately does end up happening, right? Now listen, hypotheticals and what if situations, maybe Dr. Nakabachi, the ridiculous Dr. Nakabachi, more on him later, because I think that right there is a bit of a glaring downside to this episode, right? And perhaps to the show as a whole. The writing for that ridiculous character, that cartoony character. I mean, like I said, I didn't need to say it. You saw my reaction. I just could not buy it, man. This is just so bizarre, the choices made here for this character. But more on that later, and perhaps, some of the clunky writing I came across in this episode. It's not perfect. It's not perfect, but it's so good that, most of it kind of just makes up for little moments here and there, right? Nothing's perfect, of course. But I'd say, surprisingly, in an episode that's quite incredible, I see perhaps the biggest signs of some contrived writing and just terrible writing even. Like I said, Dr. Nakabachi. Again, more on that later. But yeah, going back to this notion of psychological damage, major psychological damage, or being psychologically scarred because of that, so soon after, being a part of that Alpha Timeline Odyssey and the highs and the lows, and, hitting rock bottom, going numb, and all of that, all those things, right? All of that is so fresh for Okabe Rintaro, right? To the point that he initially declines Amane Suzuha's request that you have to come along, right? And then, of course, Amane Suzuha proceeds to essentially dangle that carrot, right? As expected, it had to be that, and it could only be that. The notion, the possibility, the slim possibility of saving Makise Karisu, right? And that is exactly how this plays out. Though, of course, the first attempt is doomed to failure. And Amane Suzuha knew that and understood it, right? And she facilitated that failed attempt because it was necessary. Some pain is necessary. That is, one of the key components of this, right? The whole setup, the whole reason this final attempt is possible. This escape is possible, right? From Alpha and Beta into the unknown, perhaps, into, the promised land, Steins Gate, door number 3, right? Makise lives. Mayuri lives. No dystopian CERN future and no war breaking out, right? That right there is, that's quite a bit. It truly is a promised land, isn't it? To actually hit all of those, to escape all of those permutations and endgame scenarios. I mean, if all of that is actually established and the mission is a success, that could set up perhaps one of the most happiest endings I've ever encountered, and I've got my own thoughts on endings, and, sometimes the happy ending is not quite the most poignant ending, right? And that sometimes, the writer or the writing of a story has to, it has to be a bit more selective and perhaps a bit more cutthroat sometimes to deliver a poignant message. And listen, the thing is, episode 22, like I said, that really truly felt like a fantastic ending to me, right? That it really could have functioned as an ending, that it's one of the best non-finale finales. So of course, in the back of my mind, that thought is there. It exists at the moment, right? That lingering concern that I essentially got quite a powerful ending, right? A meaningful ending with thematic closure back in episode 22. Life is not about doing things over, right? So, there is that concern, that slight concern of potentially undercutting that. But again, you can kind of look at it as two different story arcs, kind of, because now it's back in the beta timeline. Now it's going all the way back to episode 1's storyline and trying to, close that out. But, the bulk of it does take place in the Alpha timeline, right? The experiences of the Alpha timeline are even more integral and important than I initially thought. And as you know, I thought those are quite important. But here, after episode 23, even more so, if that was even possible, right? And I kind of even discussed this in the last episode that the experiences that he had, the highs and the lows and everything in between, are most likely going to come into play sooner rather than later for Okabe Rintaro. And look at that, future Okabe is telling his past self, think back to the time you spent there, right? How important all of that was to this, or rather to get to this point, to be in this position. to attempt this final Operation Scold, I believe they called it. And the thing is, this really exciting thing happened. After a certain point in the episode, I did have flashes of all the things that Okabe and both I go through, right? As an audience member, of course, in the Alpha timeline, right? It becomes apparent, it becomes clear that, my goodness, everything that happened there is so much more important, right? It's directly linked to Okabe being in this position now, and also future Okabe being in this position now, right? Even though there's some, again, heartbreaking differences at play as well. But then again, in the ending, close to the ending, as he finally does get to see, and I get to see the message as well, they straight up just show me flashes of all the important things that happened in the Alpha time and all the important moments and times he spent with Makise Kurisu and developed that bond. So, that right there is fantastic directing and writing, because it already had me in that headspace before it even actually visually showed me all of that, right? So yeah, it's some tremendous stuff on display here throughout this episode. But to circle back to my initial point, this idea of future Okabe actually being the one that might have actually, gone through something I initially feared for our Okabe, right? In the moment-to-moment, beat-to-beat aftermath of the things at play here, right? Again, the psychological damage and just being psychologically scarred already, right, from his time in the Alpha timeline. The residue, right, the psychological residue of that timeline, it appears that future Okabe is the one who does go through that trajectory, that does experience all of that. Just coming to terms with all of this over the span of the next few years, and then over the span of 15 years, ultimately, working towards a solution, right? Working towards actually trying to make it happen. My understanding at this moment in time is that future Okabe did not have his own, future Okabe to guide him, right? To put in the time and the effort and the pain, and just again the psychological scarring of failing to save Makise Kurisu, right? Future Okabe didn't have anyone to get back to him into the past. Future Okabe didn't have that chance, right? So he made it so he can be the first to do it for a past Okabe, right? That's my understanding at this point, right? So punished Okabe, that's the reason I call him that, right? And like I said, show me more of that, and the thing is, there might be a good chance I might get to see more of that Okabe, right? Given that, again, there's specials, and then of course the full-length sequel or prequel or a spin-off series in Steins Gate 0, right? So maybe I might get lucky. Maybe I do get to see a bit more of that Okabe. It kind of remains to be seen. The direction that series takes, I have no clue at this point. I just don't, so I could see plenty of things I didn't even think about or have in my mind at the moment, right? But yeah, the moment I saw and the moment I understood, that Okabe's trajectory, I just wanted to see more of him, right? Those 15 years he spent. And again, everything that happened here had to be maintained because it's intrinsically linked to everything that future Okabe goes through, the trajectory he goes through, the pain, the reminder, right? The motivation that it gives him, right? The drive that it gives him, the hollowness that it gives him to ultimately, put everything into this plan, put everything into developing that time machine, right? And the thing is, episodes ago at this point, back in the Alpha timeline, around the time the Future Gadgets Lab does get raided, I think in one of those discussions, I mentioned this idea of, okay, maybe this is a necessity. Some pain is necessary, and that, perhaps this could be the moment. This could be the incident. Again, the incident being Mayuri dying over and over. Maybe this is the reason a time machine, that type of time machine, one that can allow corporeal time travel, is developed ultimately, right? Because that's the only choice they have. That ultimately the pain of losing Mayuri kind of drove Okabe and his friends to develop, to have that breakthrough for that time machine. Yes, key differences in the two time machines because of key differences in the future of those timelines, Alpha and Beta. yet they still manage something. Though, of course, later I found out that it's mostly Daru, right? But isn't that interesting? That ultimately, that kind of ends up being right but here for Makise Kurisu and the beta timeline and the development of this time machine, right? One that's essentially firing on all cylinders, other than just not having enough fuel at the moment. And that kind of introduces a bit of dramatic writing into play as well, right? Puts some stakes on it. So yeah, man, the whole thing is just really quite heartbreaking. I feel for that future Okabe so much. And, he knows the ins and outs. He knows exactly how our Okabe, this Okabe, is feeling, and he knows exactly how to get to him, right? Because he knows the things he needed, he could have used at that moment in time to maybe push a bit further. And yeah, ultimately, future Okabe does something incredible for this Okabe, our Okabe, I suppose, even though future Okabe is our Okabe as well. But you get my point, right? The Okabe that us audience has been following since day one, essentially. So yeah, man, the question and the concern I had in the middle of that episode after, Okabe ends up accidentally killing Kurisu, yeah, at that point I just didn't see how he could possibly just even move any further. And you see it on display upon return, right? That line of dialogue, "I'm so tired." Again, phenomenal voice acting on display, because that right there just hits so hard, right? Given the journey that the audience has been on alongside Okabe up until this point. Never has a statement carried such heft. "I'm so tired." And that's the reason I felt it, man. And I said, fair enough, man. I get it. I get it, man. He's been through hell and back into hell again. There's only so much someone can take. And then, of course, something really interesting happens as Mayuri slaps him. And you saw my initial reaction to that. It took me by surprise. It did. Right? But then, of course, it made sense as well as she begins to speak. But initially, that slap, it really did surprise me. But the point is, essentially, future Okabe goes through the exact same thing. He fails to save Makise Kurisu, ends up accidentally killing Makise Kurisu, again, in a devastating example of predestination paradox. There's nothing beyond that, right? He didn't get that message that he can play now, right? And again, I'm a little bit, just the whole idea of the message being played at this point, right? Being able to play the message at this point, there's still some disconnect there, right? I'll have to kind of go through it and work through it, I suppose. There could be a really simple explanation that it's as simple as, okay, the world line just shifted, and now in this one, it is playable. The conditions have been met, and the condition being he has to fail once to save Makise Kurisu, because, that right there is really, really quite important to everything that comes after for future Okabe as well. But yeah, future Okabe didn't have that, right? So that's it. He essentially just has to live with it, right, after that first attempt. This is my understanding of it at this point. But again, there's two different moments here, though, right? Two big moments that kind of lead up to the breakthrough, right? The return to form, the declaration, and all of that incredible stuff in the conclusion. Again, like I mentioned, Mayuri slapping him, right? And then again, getting through to him, because no one knows Okabe like Mayuri does. I've said it before on plenty of occasions. She might not understand the ins and outs of, the technical stuff that they discuss and, time travel and all of that. But she's a heart. She's a beating heart of the story. She has emotional intelligence in spades. And yeah, she understood that, Okabe needs this, and I need to be there for Okabe now. Right? So there is that, future Okabe might have gotten that aspect of it through Mayuri, right? Was that not enough? Ultimately, does that not just end up being enough, right? And a lack of, getting his own version of a future Okabe speaking to him and outlining the final attempt, the final mission, and the premise of the whole thing, right? And the goals that have to be met, the conditions that have to be met. Essentially, it is a case of staging it, and that is something I did mention and speculated in episode 1. I speculated quite a bit in episode 1, be it about time travel, mechanics, and the different paradoxes that could be at play and the different types of time travel that could be at play. And, that right there is one of the main reasons this ends up being so exciting for me, because I do have an understanding for those mechanics and the different types of time travel mechanics, right? So it is quite fulfilling and just thrilling and enjoyable to just kind of come full circle and get some answers to all of that speculation that I had, right? Some is essentially spot on, some is in the ballpark, and some is debunked, I suppose. Yeah, but I feel like I really kind of covered a lot of that ground in episode 1, right? And see, that right there, I think is a bit of a difference, right? I think this episode is probably so shocking for many people. And I'm speaking of the people that might not have had, time travel knowledge or the mechanics of it, right? In fiction. For those people, this must have been quite a mindfuck, a legitimate twist and just devastating, right? Seeing Okabe being the one to stab her, right? Now listen, seeing it happen is still, it's still a bit of a gut punch for me, but then at the same time, it's not that big of a twist for me specifically, and I'm sure for many that are, quite versed in time travel mechanics. Predestination paradox is something I spoke of quite a bit, though, that's not the only major one that's on display here, and, you could see, why exactly that's the one on display for the main chunk of it, right? Makise Kirisu getting stabbed and dying and all of that, because it's just one of the most dramatic ones, right? This notion that you do everything possible to change something, but then in a devastating twist for that person, it ends up being themselves, right? Who causes it in the first place, right? Them being there at that moment in time, at that precise moment in time, facilitates it in the first place. That's why it's one of the most effective choices in any, time travel stories, right? Because it's so dramatic in its delivery and the writing that takes place because of it. But I also saw a prime example, a fantastic example of retrocausality. Future Okabe getting in contact with past Okabe, our Okabe, present Okabe, right? But again, past Okabe from future Okabe's perspective. So it's retrocausality on display, because that input is directly going to alter the things that are about to play during the mission, this final mission that Okabe is about to put into motion. But yeah, man, this case of predestination paradox is as dramatic as it gets, right? To go from making that sacrifice to go from letting Kurisu go in the Alpha timeline, right? And legitimately living with that choice to then be given this opening, right? And to see that, this time her mission, Amani Suza's mission's the opposite, right? To get that chance to then ultimately being the reason the love of your life ends up dying in the first place. My God. God. Anytime I mention this, I just keep thinking of future Okabe, man. I just do. I feel for him so much, because ultimately knowing that, you're going to get to see her again, in theory at least, is one thing, right? You see that his eyes just light up, and that's the desired effect, of course. Even more so a little bit later, once Amani Suzaha confirms that indeed, she knew exactly how this is about to play out, but she had to take him down that road. And yeah, that must have been tough for Amani Suzaha as well. But, like I said, Amani Suzaha just so composed. She has this confidence about her, because again, she comes from a different timeline, or a different future rather, right? You see it in the uniform, how put together she is, how experienced she is, and you see it through the support system that she does have in this timeline, in the beta timeline, right? That she does have a relation with her own father, Daru, and Okabe Rintaro, so much so that, she just refers to him as uncle, right? Simply because, Daru is his best friend, or, that is Daru's best friend. And, it's a close friendship, close relationship, to the point that, she probably grew up knowing Okabe, right? As just her uncle, So I love that so much. There's just so much stuff here that made me so happy, right? Amani Suzaha being back on the scene, and her, coming across, or being, with Mayuri and Daru, even though, yes, of course, the dynamic is a little bit different. It's not the same relationship that I saw in the Alpha timeline, but just knowing that, they're together again, in each other's company, and that she knows that Daru is her father, even though our Daru here doesn't quite know, and she's being cheeky. And, there's a lot of fun moments of him just kind of looking behind them. It's like, did someone else sneak up here? Who's she referring to here? Winking at him and just being so proud, that smile on her face to see her so proud of Daru, her father. So yeah, I guess they didn't really open up about that. Didn't really get it out in the open. There's still one more episode. Maybe, they'll talk about it in passing or again, off screen. And now it's just known that, okay, this is my daughter from the future. But yeah, I just love that. I love that so much for Amane Suzuha. Yes, it's still a bit of a tricky future that she comes from, but I suppose in comparison, a bit of a better future for her specifically, right? In comparison to Alpha Timeline Amane Suzuha, right? The lone wolf, essentially. But yeah, going back to that idea of getting to see the love of your life again, right? Okabe getting to see Makise Kurisu again. Again, in principle, it's exciting. Of course it's exciting, but once it happens, once it's right there, once he is back in the radio building, right? Sneaking around. And just that, you could probably hear it in my voice. I mean, it's just so exciting to come full circle, to finally kind of get to see it from the other side, right? Because they made it really quite clear that there is another Okabe sneaking around, and not just another Okabe, Amane Suzuha as well. And, a few episodes after episode 1, and by the time, it is confirmed that, yes, she is a time traveler, officially confirmed at least, it became really clear to me that indeed that was Amane Suzuha on the rooftop, and that is a time machine that carried both of them, and both of them are at play at the radio building, though Amane Suzuha just kind of stays out of it, right? Though again, I don't know how things could change and shift in this final attempt, in this final episode, right? Like I said, I'm expecting some twists and turns and, again, some unknowns, right? It's not about to be smooth sailing, because if it is, it's not about to be exciting, right? Or engaging. It simply is not going to be smooth sailing. And I know that for a fact, because I know that something happens. And Okabe, the one that is attempting now the final mission, is, I don't know, just somehow is going to be in pain, right? And there's, again, a lot of different, what if situations. That's a type of pain and agony. Now, listen, I did think that maybe it could be acting, right? Staging comes to mind. Though, again, there might be some staging that is required. But even that kind of feels a bit unrealistic at this point, right? How exactly do you get Makise Kurisu, who's just meeting you, to be in on it, right? I think it's exceedingly unlikely that Makise Kurisu is actually going to be in on it, right? Because everything happens rather quickly as well. So, to actually explain everything to her and then somehow get her to be in on it, it's just unrealistic. It's not practical at all, right? So I can almost kind of cross that off, that she'll be in on it, but it still has to be set up. It has to be staged, right? Deception is the name of the game. Deceive the world, deceive causality itself. In this really unique case of Schrodinger's Kurisu, if you will, there's some exciting stuff at play here, right? Some exciting ideas, interesting ideas, fascinating ideas, really, at play here. That ultimately, it's not that Kurisu dies, but that Okabe sees that body laying there and assumes that, someone killed Makise Kurisu, someone stabbed Makise Kurisu, because that's essentially how it looks to him on first glance. And of course, seeing that sight, it has to be incredibly jarring, and it is incredibly jarring. And yeah, it does a number on that Okabe, and ultimately it leads to him sending out that infamous first D-mail. Bad news, I think someone stabbed Makise Kurisu, and off he goes into the Alpha Timeline Odyssey. And that is a necessity. That is integral to all of this, right? To finally come back and be in this position. So ultimately, the name of the game here is that Okabe has to think that he's come across the dead body of Makise Kurisu, right? So he can send that D-mail. I think that right there is a key component of this. I think they have made that quite clear here, right? Because if it's not that, then, it becomes kind of muddy. It becomes really muddy, right? Listen, I'm not saying that everything's airtight. There actually are a few things that are that I'm not really quite able to crack or make sense of just yet, you know? But again, I have one more episode. I've got a finale ahead of me. And, there could be a lot of big moments there, a lot of explanations, essentially, right? And, I've got my own expectations of the finale as well. Perhaps the two main ones that kind of stand out at the moment, at least, are, some sort of explanation for reading Steiner, right? Because that's just been there at this point since the beginning, and it's one of the most important things, one of the most important driving factors or functions of this story, of this narrative, right? That he retains his memories across timelines, right? Though, of course, I've seen special cases of residual memories leaking through as well. But again, nothing in comparison to Okabe's reading Steiner. So yes, I do kind of need an explanation for that, right? Something. Give me something. And then, of course, Daru and Mayuri's role in this final mission. Daru I'm not too sure about, but Mayuri, as you know, I've kind of discussed it on a few occasions now, that, things feeling a bit odd about Mayuri in episode 1, the camera actually lingers on her as she smiles and looks off into the other direction. So, long story short, I've always kind of thought that maybe that another Mayuri maybe could be at play here as well, jumping in, or a substitute in really distinct moments, perhaps. That's how it was kind of presented in episode 1. There's something a little bit off about that Mayuri. But there's other factors at play as well, right? The plan itself. Save Kurisu and enter Steins Gate. You must destroy the paper on time machines that Nakabachi takes to Russia, right? So that's another thing that has to be addressed. Yeah, the whole Metalupa situation, I'm not even sure, what the hell is going on there. Did that piece of shit actually just grab it and just steal that as well? I mean, and to be honest, I thought it's a little bit bizarre, those kind of papers are left in the cargo, or are about to be left in the cargo in the first place, if I'm remembering correctly. I mean, you would just assume something that important is something he'd be keeping really quite close to his chest, literally, rather than, leaving in the cargo space, so maybe there's a bit of a disconnect there. Maybe I'm not understanding this quite correctly, but that's how it appeared, and the Metalupa, the metal aspect of it, set off the detectors, right? And if it didn't do that, then, he wouldn't have grabbed the papers, or it would have just continued into the cargo space, the papers themselves, right? I believe that is the thing that's being presented here, right? But yeah, man, the Metalupa coming back into the fold in this capacity was not on the cards. On my card, at least. But it turns out that rare missing Metalupa is actually quite important. So I don't know, maybe they'll even finally show me how exactly Mayuri just lost it all of a sudden, right? And it ends up there, with Nakabachi. Listen, let me just get this out the way. Right? Dr. Nakabachi. Like I said a little bit earlier, it's just a terrible character. It's terrible writing. It's a ridiculous character. It's cartoony. It's over the top. It's corny, right? It just absolutely sticks out like a sore thumb. It just, everything just is so off about the writing of this character. It's an academic. First of all, it's an academic, right? So just his behavior, it just doesn't check out to begin with. And then, there's that moment he pulls out a switchblade. Man's out here looking like a Yakuza soldier or something, right? That look on his face as he pulls out a switchblade. Why the hell does an academic have a switchblade? I simply cannot understand how someone like him from that field could have this type of attitude about his own daughter, an academic, this type of resentment and disdain for his own daughter, right? I think there's this ridiculous line of dialogue there, a daughter should never be smarter than her father, stuff like that. It's really off-putting. It's really bizarre, It took me out of it. As you saw, it really kind of took me out of it from beginning to end. His attitude, it just gets worse and worse and even more unrealistic. His actions are baffling. His mindset is baffling. It's just really bizarre character writing choices here. And you see that through the writing of this character and just the inclusion of this character, it kind of brings down some of the writing for some of the other characters as well. Like I said, at one point the dialogue's beginning to feel a bit clunky. The character of Makise Kirisu essentially dabbling in, as you know, dialogue. It felt rather contrived and clunky. Immediately it felt clunky. And yes, of course, I have seen some super anime stuff in this story, in this anime. Some really specific tropes and, fan service, I suppose. But this right here, man, this takes the cake. This right here just feels like such a glaring outlier as far as writing is concerned, character writing is concerned. I have to go in on this. This is just kind of unforgivable stuff. And I really don't think I'm being harsh, like one bit. This is just terrible writing. But even so, Makise Kurisu still jumps in front of him to save his life, to save him from getting stabbed, right? Because ultimately, Okabe is trying to save Makise Kurisu in that moment from her own father, who is more than ready to actually. I think it's fair to assume that he actually might have. Listen, it's impossible to know if he would have actually killed her, but he was ready to maybe stab her at least. I mean, he certainly has no problems dishing out, physical abuse, and that kind of just finally confirms something that's been a bit of a known thing, right? You could just tell by her reactions to things. A lot of times it's quite subtle, but it happens a few times to the point that okay, you can kind of tell, and you bring in her fractured relationship with her father, as she describes herself. Yeah, you just kind of put two and two together. Even earlier, she's quite jumpy again as Okabe approaches her. Right, and I've got to go back to that moment Okabe comes face to face with, the love of his life, right? And he completely just loses his bearings. There's a tight shot of his face. You see as the tears build up, right? That's a distressed look she mentioned back in episode 1, right? 15 minutes ago, you tried to tell me something, right? So yeah, knowing that you might see her again in person, in the flesh is one thing, but then actually seeing her after, again, that incredibly devastating goodbye and choice he had to make in the Alpha timeline, that's another thing. And I see the raw reaction of that, right? And she sees the raw reaction of that to the point that I thought maybe that triggered something within, that maybe something familiar, that she feels a sense of familiarity, with this person. I think she might have. They didn't have to spell it out, but given the things I've seen in this anime already, maybe she did feel something there, right? Again, there's a tight shot of her eyes as well. They do that thing of the anime thing, I suppose, of the shaky eyes almost, right? Usually during emotional moments. But yeah, ultimately, Kurisu's desire to belong, right? To be cared for, to be accepted by her father, right? Listen, man, this has to be a prime contender for perhaps the worst anime father out there. I mean, I know there's a few, and I've seen a few myself at this point on the channel, but this is just beyond a bad father. This is just an absolute piece of shit human being, right? And again, beyond that, just a terribly written character altogether. But even so, she, like I said, man, I suppose your father is your father, right? And you've only got one father, right? And for some reason, she just really wants to be accepted by him. And if you go back to some of the stuff I learned in the Alpha timeline, it clearly has stuff to do with her growing up, just kind of looking up to her father, right? Being, or trying to be like her father, being into all the things her father's into, right? So there's that connection there. But, it turns sour rather quickly once, it becomes apparent that she actually is already exceeding beyond his own limits, beyond his own capabilities, right? Beyond his own intelligence. That's one of the things that eats away at him the most. The jealousy. It's just, I just kind of want to move on from Dr. Nakabachi. Just slimy, a slimy character altogether. But listen, before I move on from Dr. Nakabachi, this idea of Okabe being in pain and agony, unless of course he's some kind of Oscar-worthy actor, right? And he actually is just performing that, again, exceedingly unlikely. It feels a little too raw and authentic for that to just be a performance. Listen, man, that's the type of pain you could feel from getting stabbed, right? I saw a stabbing take place here, right? So maybe Okabe is the one who ends up getting stabbed instead of Makise Kurisu. Maybe he's the one who jumps in front of Makise Kurisu. Maybe a similar altercation is taking place, and maybe it's just a tad bit different. But maybe he's the one who finds himself having to jump in front of Makise Kurisu, much like how Mayuri jumped in front of Okabe, right, in the Alpha timeline. But yeah, man, getting stabbed, that could be the type of pain and agony that could, draw out that type of scream, right? But again, let's kind of switch it up again. Maybe it's not jumping in front of Makise Kurisu. Maybe this time, the altercation is between Okabe and Dr. Nakabachi, and maybe Makise Kurisu is already knocked out, right? Because I think one of the main things that you immediately kind of have to think of as far as staging is concerned, you're going to have to knock her out, right? You simply have to, right? Because I already touched up on that whole notion of bringing her on board, right? There's just not enough time, and it's just not practical, and it's not realistic. So she has to be knocked out. If you're going to stage it and not kill her, she simply has to be knocked out. And then, of course, you've got to, sell the blood, right? And knocking her out doesn't automatically mean physically knocking her out. A sedative, maybe, that could be at play. But then, of course, you have to, think of the blood and all of that. Now, listen, as I'm talking about it, I'm almost kind of giving myself more possibilities and potential answers. I kind of assume that, okay, if you're going to stage it, you're going to need fake blood. So if he is to get stabbed, right, in any sort of altercation between him and Dr. Nakabachi, that's going to give him some blood, right? So look at that, I mean, it's dark. It is dark, but that is a possibility as well. It might be his own blood that might be used for staging the whole thing. But again, there's a Dr. Nakabachi angle in all of this. He's going to be a part of it still, right? But again, that's my assumption. Maybe things change. Maybe things are going to change. And, that's the thing I keep going on about. Episode 24 might have its own twists and turns along the way. But yeah, finishing up my point on Makise Kurisu and, this notion of trying to reconcile with her dad, and it just being so one-sided to the point that he takes it as an insult that she would even think of trying to share credit, right, even though it's her idea, right? Even that sets him off, even though she's the one who's actually kind of trying to build that bridge across. But yeah, just this idea of being cared for in that capacity, much like how she said, or she didn't have to say it, I kind of just assumed, and again, through the writing of the anime leading up to that point, this connection that Okabe has with Mayuri and just how much he cares for her, she saw that, she understood it, and you see, it's that shot of her, and she's got purple hair, and she's shedding a few tears. I knew and I've understood for some time that she longs for that type of connection, right? Especially with her own father. But even there, you see another striking difference, right, from Alpha and Beta. Here, this Kurisu is predisposed to time travel, right? The notion of time travel, open to it, essentially. In comparison to the Alpha timeline, at first she is just completely against the whole thing to the point that she gets agitated, right? She gets angry, to the point that Okabe decides to just drop the subject at the laundry place, right? And at that point, she does bring up the mistakes of her father. I'm not going to go down the same path as my father, right? So again, some key differences there. But as far as necessary framework is concerned, this is such a unique take. This idea that he has to first kill Kurisu, accidentally, of course, so he ultimately has the required pain, right? The necessary pain, the drive, the determination, the motivation to ensure that she doesn't die again in that manner, right? It's really, really interesting stuff, a really unique take. And yes, even though I don't really get to see it or experience it, as of this point at least, I am seeing 15 years of planning and execution on display here, right? 15 years of pain and determination and all of that has gone into this, right? And luckily, it's almost kind of been put on a plate for our Okabe, right? He still has to walk through the door, and there's still unknowns ahead of him in this final episode. But it's a big thing. It's a massive thing to have future Okabe step in for this Okabe, right? Something future Okabe did not have. Otherwise, he wouldn't be spending those 15 years. And this kind of does bring me back to some of my talking points from episode 1 as well, the speculation and the hypotheticals and the what if scenarios. Listen, I'll be honest, I'm rather proud of that discussion. I am. But yeah, I spoke of this idea in time travel narratives of trying to guide yourself, right, to a certain point, to finding out a certain thing, right, potentially sending your past self on a path you've been on already, stuff that you've experienced already, but you need your past self to go down the same path. And that is literally how this is playing out. It's at play. And again, like I said, that's the difference, knowing time travel mechanics and, common writing choices in time travel narratives and not knowing any of that. I think it's a bit of a night and day experience. It'd be interesting to actually see some reaction content to see how, different people kind of react, first time reactions to some of these time travel mechanics at play, right? I'm going to go ahead and guess many are bamboozled by it. And I believe in the discussion for episode 1, I actually brought up that he didn't actually see the stabbing, right? I didn't actually get to see the stabbing either. And that I'm not eliminating the possibility of that being staged. Again, all of this is just because of common time travel writing choices, time travel mechanics, writing choices specifically, right? So all of that, a lot of it actually is quite on point, ends up being quite on point. But, before I forget, let's kind of focus a bit more on the scream itself. Now, like I said, there's something really fascinating that could be at play here that I've already experienced the final mission, right? At play during episode 1. But, as I think about it a bit more, there's a few inconsistencies in that, right? Things aren't quite lining up exactly as I initially thought. I keep assuming it's going to be the exact same scream. That's my assumption. That's my expectation. But what if that's just not the case? What if it is just a case of, it's not really, they didn't really try to match them up, right? The screams. But I also say, surely it's got to be by design that the screams sound different. So, at this point, I just kind of need to get to episode 24 to see for sure. But again, like I said, even though I don't get to see it and experience it, as of this point at least, there's 15 years of planning and execution on display. So there actually could be much more planning and staging and moving the pieces on the chessboard, if you will, right, to execute this whole thing that I simply do not know of yet. And then, of course, like I said, there's the specials, there's the movie itself, and again, the full-length series, Steins Gate 0, right? So listen, it certainly makes me excited for all of that stuff. I can tell you that much, especially if there's, any possibility of getting to see more of that punished Okabe, the Okabe that didn't have his own future Okabe, getting contact with that message, right, from the future, the suave Okabe, as Mayuri called him, the one that had to just take it, accept it, and move on somehow, and then spend those 15 years, with that psychological damage. And, just kind of come to terms with it and ultimately lift himself to the point of having that breakthrough, right? And putting all of this into motion and then sending it back to this Okabe, right? Because he knows exactly what he needed at that point. But, going back to this idea of already potentially seeing the final mission at play in episode 1 or during episode 1, one of the speed bumps I kind of run into is this idea of, okay, if that is a final mission, that means this is our Okabe's second attempt now, right? The whole, potentially staging the whole thing and deceiving, everything and everyone and all of that, the world and, causality itself and himself, Okabe that is. Doesn't that mean that the static should have worked, right? The message that he got. But again, I kind of touched upon this idea of, okay, maybe it is as simple as maybe slightly changing to a different timeline as well, right? Because then, you also have that idea of too many Okabes running around, right? So there has to be some control here as far as, shifting to other timelines, so that there's only ever two Okabes rather, running around in the radio building. One that's just kind of there and experiencing a lot of these things, and one that is running around, sneaking around and, setting things up and then accidentally stabbing Makise Kirisu, and then of course running it back a second time, the final mission, right? The one I might be seeing play out during episode 1. But now I'm kind of almost not so sure anymore about that, because again, if the final mission is taking place, that means that Okabe has already seen the message, right? And has put it into motion at this point. But our Okabe, the initial Okabe who gets the message, only sees static, right? But the fact is, the message still arrived, right? But I suppose a condition hasn't been met yet, right? Of failing to save Makise Kirisu once. And again, that condition has to be met because failing to save Makise Kirisu sends our future Okabe on quite a path, quite a journey. And ultimately, some pain pushes you to new heights, right? To a point that you never really could have reached before, right? So yeah, ultimately it always goes back to that. Some pain is necessary, right? Some things simply have to be maintained because of just the driving force of that significant moment. And let me just kind of touch up on the score, the song selection. My goodness, that new track that comes in right in the conclusion. Oh my goodness, it really is one of the most uplifting and, again, exhilarating and thrilling moments, right? Leading up to Good Luck, L, Sai, Kanguru. You saw my reaction to that. It got me going, man. It really did get me going. And that's by design, isn't it? That's just one of those moments. It just is. I'm sure many people had the exact same reaction as me. It really felt quite earned, didn't it? But just from the beginning of the episode, it really kind of felt like full-on sci-fi once again, right? That, sci-fi is back on the menu. And that's through, again, the song selection or the score that's accompanying these scenes, right? It really kind of put me back in that sci-fi mood. And that really specific tone took me back to the early days of the anime, right? As I'm discovering all of this alongside Okabe. And yeah, the early days of the anime has that sci-fi tone to it. And this takes you right back. And it makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? Because it is coming full circle again. But yeah, man, Okabe Rintaro's had it tough, to hold the dead body of your lifelong friend, your childhood friend, and the dead body of the love of your life, right? Because you accidentally caused it as well. Yeah, man. I mean, again, I do kind of keep going back to future Okabe from 15 years from now, right? I keep calling him Punished Okabe for a reason, man. It's heartbreaking stuff. It really is. But, due to his efforts, this Okabe, our Okabe, the one I've been following since day one, now has a chance, right, to go through door number 3, right? Kind of have his cake and eat it too, if it actually plays out, But yeah, ultimately, the stage is set, right? You must not alter established past events. You must not undo what your first self saw, right? Change the outcome without altering established past events. So yeah, man, it's some tremendous setup. It's excellent setup, exceptional setup, for the grand finale. It's exciting. It's bittersweet, of course, because it is the last episode. And I do have some expectations. There's a lot of things that still kind of need to add up. There's a few things throughout this episode that do need to add up, but I'm just going to allow the next episode to kind of play out, and see if I get my connections and explanations there. But yeah, folks, if you enjoyed that, consider dropping a like, consider dropping some comments, give me your thoughts. If you are interested in early access or full opacity or even full length, timer-based full length, of course, consider checking out the Patreon page and also supporting the channel in the process of it all. Right then, thank you so much for joining me, folks, and thank you for your time, because time is precious. It really is. And I do hope to see you again soon for the next one, for the final one. Until then, take it easy.